There is a kind of silence that only certain places in the Appalachian Mountains hold, and it is not the peaceful silence of an empty room or a still morning. It is something much older than that, a dense and pressurized weight that makes your own footsteps sound like a rude intrusion on the land. If you were a traveler moving through western North Carolina in the late 1800s and heading west toward Tennessee, you really only had two choices. You could go around, which meant 50 miles of ridge hopping through country that would take 3 days in good weather, or you could choose to go through the hollow. Most people chose the hollow. The last man to see one of those travelers alive said he watched him duck into the gap in the ridgeline and heard his boots on the creek stones for a few seconds before the sound vanished. After that, there was nothing at all but the water moving the same way it always had, and for 3 generations, one family controlled every single soul that passed through that gap. The outside world either didn't know what was happening or they didn't think it was worth the trouble to find out. You need to understand what a hollow actually is because it is not the wide, open space most people picture when they think of the mountains. It isn't a valley with farmland and multiple ways in and out, but rather what happens when 2 ridgelines push toward each other until they nearly meet. This leaves a narrow slot of ground between them with a creek running down the middle, and the walls do not slope gently at all. They rise hard and steep, often so sharp that a man on horseback couldn't hope to climb them, and they are covered in rhododendrons so thick you would lose a person 10 feet off the trail. Western North Carolina in the 1880s and 90s had dozens of these places, with some running for 3 or 4 miles and sitting so deep that the sun only cleared the ridgeline for a few hours at noon. In the dead of winter, some of these hollows didn't see a single ray of direct light for weeks at a time. No roads reached inside them, and no telegraph wires connected them to the world, which meant the county seat might be 20 miles away, but effectively unreachable in the bad weather that gripped the mountains for 5 months a year. If a sheriff wanted to enter a hollow, he had to ride the trail in single file, while remaining in plain sight of anyone watching from the ridge above. And almost no one chose to do that without a very good reason. The families who settled these places in the 1830s had already been living outside the normal flow of American life for a generation or two. They came from the older Scots-Irish settlements or the Virginia backcountry, and by 1900, the grandchildren of those original settlers had never lived anywhere else. The county was just an abstraction to them, a name on a piece of paper or a tax that they ignored, and the sheriff was a man who existed only in theory. The specific hollow at the center of this story sat in the western part of the state, pressed between 2 ridge walls that ran parallel for 3 miles, before the creek finally emptied into a wider drainage below. There was one trail in and the same trail out, and the creek ran loud enough year-round to cover the sound of anything happening in the brush. It was a place that rewarded whoever controlled the entrance and punished everyone else. And while the geography didn't create the family, it certainly chose them. The man who started all of this wasn't a bandit, and that is the first thing you have to understand if you want to see how this place actually worked. Bandits are like a summer storm that robs people and moves on, but what this family built was something much slower that took root in the ground like the laurel thickets on the ridge walls. It was patient, it was spreading, and it became almost impossible to clear once it finally got established in the dirt. The patriarch arrived in the hollow sometime in the late 1840s, or perhaps the early 1850s, bringing a wife and at least 2 older boys with him. He carried that particular set of habits common to men who have already decided the rules of the world don't apply to them, yet he didn't announce himself with any fanfare. He just settled at the narrow end of the trail where the hollow pinched tightest, and waited to see who came through his new territory. The first form of taxation he practiced was almost reasonable by the logic of the time, because if you wanted to use the trail, you simply paid something for the privilege. Sometimes it was a coin, or a portion of your load, or even just a meal shared at the fire. Travelers in mountain country understood that hospitality always had a price, and many of them paid without a single complaint, because the alternative was taking the long route around the ridge. They saw a man watching them from his porch with 2 boys standing silently behind him, and they realized he was the kind of person you paid without asking too many questions. That is how the whole thing started, as an informal and unwritten toll that was enforced by a quiet presence rather than an explicit threat. But here's what changes over time when nobody challenges a system, because the system eventually stops being a toll and starts being something else entirely. By the mid-1850s, the patriarch wasn't just collecting passage fees from travelers, but was also settling disputes between the few families who had their own small plots deeper in the hollow. He was deciding who got access to the best stretch of the creek and who had to move their fences, which meant he was governing in a language nobody would have used at the time. He didn't have any formal authority, but he held the only authority that actually matters in an isolated place, which is the authority of the man willing to make a decision stick. And that authority needed a demonstration sooner or later. The first killing the family was connected to happen sometime before the Civil War, though the exact year didn't survive in any official record. What survived was the shape of the event, involving a traveler who refused to pay or perhaps refused to leave when he was told to go. The details shifted depending on who told the story and how many years had passed, but the outcome never changed. The man was gone. The patriarch was still sitting on his porch the next morning, and nobody in the county ever came to ask a single question about what happened. That silence was the most important thing that happened in the entire history of the Hollow, because it wasn't the killing itself that mattered, but the silence that followed it. Once a killing absorbs into the landscape without any consequence, it becomes a permanent fact about the place that everyone has to accept. Travelers heard about the family the same way they heard about dangerous flood crossings or bad sections of trail, treating them as just another hazard to account for on the road. The patriarch understood exactly what that reputation did for his business, and it meant he didn't have to threaten most people anymore, because they arrived already knowing the cost. They paid before they were even asked, and the money flowed into his pockets without him having to say a word. Inside the hollow, among the handful of other families and the neighbors who depended on that trail, the dynamic was different, but it certainly wasn't any simpler. Those people didn't pay in coin, but instead they paid in deference by staying quiet when they should have spoken up. They vouched for the family when outsiders asked questions, and they absorbed the occasional piece of violence directed at their own kin as the cost of living in a place where the patriarch's words settled every argument. He died sometime in the 1870s, most likely, though no death record has ever been confirmed by the state. By then, it didn't much matter who the man himself had been, because the Hollow ran on its own logic that he had spent 30 years building one unanswered incident at a time. The ground itself seemed to enforce his rules now, and his sons didn't have to build anything new because they only had to keep what was already theirs. The second generation inherited the kingdom, but they also inherited its appetite. There is a particular kind of danger in men who inherit power they never had to fight for. The patriarch had built his system through patience and calculation, using the slow accumulation of unanswered moments to cement his control over the Hollow. He understood the mechanism of power because he had assembled it piece by piece with his own hands, but his sons understood none of that history. What they understood was the result, which included the deference of their neighbors and the way people looked at the ground when the family walked past. They grew up inside a world where their name alone moved people out of the way, and they mistook that effect for a natural condition of the universe, rather than something that had to be maintained with discipline. That is the real difference between the first generation and the second, because the father understood that fear was a tool, while the sons treated it like a birthright. The taxation didn't disappear under the sons, but instead it expanded into something much broader and more invasive. What their father had collected as coins and provisions became grain stored in the family's barn that never quite made it back to the neighbors who grew it. Timber was cut by local men who somehow ended up owing more labor than they had originally agreed to. And women in the Hollow understood that certain requests from the brothers weren't really requests at all. It wasn't a formal system, and it didn't need to be, because the logic was already embedded in every transaction and every conversation that took place on their land. And the violence changed too, becoming less of a calculated move and more of a reflexive habit. The patriarch had used violence the way a skilled carpenter uses a specific tool, which is to say he used it deliberately and not very often because overuse dulls the effect. His sons used it more like a hand they were born with, and when a traveler from Tennessee pushed back against the toll in the late 1870s, the response was immediate and completely disproportionate. The traveler wasn't just turned away from the trail, but was beaten so badly that his companions had to carry him out of the hollow on a litter made of cut branches. Two of those men left their goods behind rather than risk being identified as witnesses to what they had seen that day. They did not go to the sheriff. No one did, because the sheriff had a problem that wasn't unique to this county, but was certainly amplified by the geography of the hollow. To enter that land, he would have to ride a narrow creekside trail with high ridge walls on both sides, and everyone in a 30-mile radius knew what had happened the last time a deputy tried. He had been turned back at the tree line by men with rifles positioned high above the trail, and the warning was delivered from a distance too far to answer with a pistol. The deputy came home alive, the sheriff filed no report, and the political math remained simple enough for everyone to understand. The hollow produced no tax revenue, the family had no enemies powerful enough to make real trouble, and the men who lived inside it voted reliably for whoever promised to leave them alone. So the stories spread through other channels, and timber crews began to talk about the family around their own fires. Revenue agents who were supposed to be hunting illegal stills came back with reports that mentioned the hollow the way a sailor mentions a dangerous reef. Travelers who made it through described the experience with the careful language of men who weren't sure they'd never have to make that trip again, so they kept their descriptions vague and their voices low. But the stories accumulated over the years, and stories have a way of reaching people who were never intended to hear them. The second generation understood this at some level, because they weren't completely without their father's calculation. There was still a version of the family's internal code at work, which meant they didn't prey on each other, and they maintained a surface-level protection for the families deepest in the hollow. They kept their worst behavior pointed outward at strangers, rather than inward at their own network. And that restraint was the only thing that kept the hollow functional across 40 years of their rule. But functional is not the same thing as stable, and restraint built on self-interest rather than principle tends to erode exactly when it is needed most. A kingdom built on fear has one major structural weakness, and that is the fact that fear always has a ceiling. The hollow had survived 30 years under the rule of the second generation by being, in a practical sense, invisible to the rest of the world. It wasn't that the place was hidden from a map, because anyone with a county survey could find the creek drainage if they looked hard enough. But it was invisible in the way places become when no one with power has a reason to care. The land didn't produce enough tax revenue to matter to the state. It didn't sit on a trade route worth protecting, and the men living there were poor and violent. For most of the 19th century, that specific combination of poverty and distance was exactly what kept the outside world from looking too closely at what happened behind those ridges. That calculation started shifting in the late 1890s, and the reason for the change was the trees. Western North Carolina was in the middle of a period that looked like economic progress from a distance, but on the ground, it was an all-out assault on the landscape. The timber industry had been working its way through the southern Appalachians for years, clear-cutting the lower slopes and the easy ridges before floating the logs down whatever river would carry them to a mill. By the 1890s, the easy timber was mostly gone, which meant the companies started looking at the harder country, where the hollows were steep and the creek drainages were tight. These were the places that had been left alone for decades, because getting equipment in and logs out required more effort than the wood seemed worth at the time. Everything changed the moment the railroad surveyors showed up with their chains and their transit levels. A rail line cutting through that mountain terrain transformed the economics of the timber industry overnight, making wood that was once worthless suddenly worth a fortune because a track existed to carry it away. The companies financing those surveys didn't hire men who were easily discouraged by local reputations or whispers of mountain feuds. They employed men with legal contracts and the authority to survey a right-of-way. And those employers had lawyers and capital and absolutely no patience for a family on a creek trail telling them where they could and couldn't walk. Timber scouts had been drifting into the county since the mid-1890s. and most of them were smart enough to route around the hollow the way experienced travelers had always done. By 1900, however, they were coming more frequently, and they weren't turning back, because their maps showed the creek drainage as a potential log float corridor. They had orders to assess the timber on those high ridge walls, and they had the institutional backing of companies that didn't mind filing complaints with county governments when their employees were interfered with. One scout eventually came out of the hollow with a broken arm and a story he told to his employer, who then wrote a formal letter to the county sheriff. This wasn't just another rumor from a drifter or a complaint from a dirt-poor mountain family that could be ignored. The letter came from a company with capital and political connections, and it described specific men, specific actions, and a specific location that the sheriff could no longer overlook. That was something the family hadn't dealt with before. At roughly the same time, federal revenue enforcement was getting much more systematic in the mountain counties than it had been in the years following the war. The government had been trying to collect excise tax on mountain whiskey since Reconstruction, with very little success. But the operations in the late 1890s were better funded and more persistent. Revenue agents working western North Carolina began compiling detailed reports on locations that obstructed their movement or threatened their men. The hollow appeared in at least 2 of those reports as a noted obstacle, described as a place their circuits avoided because the risk to the agents simply wasn't worth the reward. When 2 separate federal complaints pointed at the same geography within a few years of each other, the situation took on a different weight than anything the hollow had generated in the past. The family understood that something was shifting in the air, even if they couldn't put a name to the pressure they felt. Their response was predictable, because when pressure comes from outside a system built on local dominance, the instinct is to lean harder on the tools that built that dominance in the first place. They maintained more visible control over the trail, fewer travelers made it through without some kind of incident, and there was a demonstrated willingness to escalate violence. It was all meant to communicate that the ground still belonged to them, and the cost of entering was still set by the men who lived there. What they couldn't see was that the same behavior that had protected them for 60 years was now generating a paper trail. Every incident with a timber scout and every turned-back revenue agent was adding to a picture that was starting to exist in offices and in the hands of men who couldn't be frightened off a trail. By 1901, the hollow had a problem it couldn't solve with a rifle and a reputation, because you can't shoot a legal document or scare a government report into silence. The event that finally broke the silence wasn't the worst thing the family had ever done, and it probably wasn't even close to the most violent. What made it different was the identity of the person involved. In the late months of 1901, a man went into the hollow and didn't come back out. That by itself wasn't unusual, as the hollow had been swallowing men for 50 years, and most of those disappearances had dissolved into the category of things mountain people knew better than to ask about. But this particular man had a name that meant something in the county seat, and he wasn't a drifter with no one to notice he was gone. He was a surveyor working under a well-documented contract, and his employer expected weekly reports that suddenly stopped arriving after a specific date. His name appeared in payroll records and in correspondence with a timber company that had already filed a complaint about the hollow the previous year. When he didn't show up for his next scheduled meeting, the company didn't wait around or speculate about what might have happened. They sent a letter to the county sheriff with the surveyor's last known route, the last date he'd been seen, and the descriptions of 2 men he'd mentioned in his previous letters. These were the men stationed at the trail entrance who had questioned him on an earlier pass and only let him through after he showed his official papers. That letter was different from anything the sheriff had received before because it was specific and contained a clear timeline. It held the bones of a legal case rather than the vague complaint of a frightened traveler who just wanted to be believed by the authorities. The sheriff sat on the information for several weeks, which isn't a criticism of his character, but rather a reflection of the reality of the time. Riding into the hollow with a warrant required assembling a group of men willing to risk their lives, and finding those men required a kind of political momentum that took time to build. The company didn't let the matter sit, however. and a second letter arrived that was copied to the Federal Revenue Office in Asheville. Suddenly, the sheriff wasn't the only one holding the paper, and the pressure to act became impossible to ignore. He finally rode in with 4 deputies in the early weeks of 1902. What they found at the family's property was a household that had been partially abandoned in a hurry, with fresh emptied shelves and a fire that had been burning recently. There was livestock still in the yard, but no men were visible anywhere on the property. 2 women remained behind, and neither of them spoke to the deputies beyond what was absolutely necessary to avoid arrest. One of the sons was located on the far ridge the following morning and taken into custody without the resistance everyone had expected. What the deputies found beyond the property was something much harder to look at. Along the creek bank, downstream from the main homestead, the ground had been disturbed in several places at different times. These were disturbances that a man who'd spent his life working mountain soil could read the way a printer reads type on a page. The surveyor's transit case eventually turned up in a ravine half a mile off the trail, partially buried under deadfall that had been placed there by hand rather than falling naturally. That was the moment when the neighbors finally started talking. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen with everyone. But the calculation shifts when a deputy is standing in front of you with physical evidence. People who had absorbed 30 years of silence because it was the price of living in the hollow's orbit began to describe specific things they had seen over the years. They talked about a traveler turned away at a certain hour, a strange sound from the creek on a night they'd been told to stay inside, and transactions involving property that didn't belong to the family. None of these accounts was dramatic on its own, but together, they assembled into a story the sheriff's office couldn't dismiss. The family tried to answer the accusations as best they could. One of the sons told the deputies the surveyor had passed through, paid his toll, and headed west without any incident. A neighbor, who still owed the family too much to speak freely, confirmed that version of events when he was asked. 2 other families even sent word through intermediaries that any trouble in the hollow had been started by outsiders rather than the men who lived there. The legal machinery was slow to turn in those mountains. But once it started moving, it didn't stop until it reached the end of the trail. The law arrived in force during the spring of 1902, and it didn't look like anything the people in the hollow had ever seen before. This wasn't just a lone deputy riding up a creek trail where he could be watched from the ridges and easily turned back by a few well-placed shots. Instead, it was a heavy group of sheriff's officers and a federal revenue agent from the Asheville office, along with 2 men hired by the timber company whose surveyor had vanished months earlier. They moved together with warrants that had been reviewed at the state level before a single horse was even saddled, and the political backing for this move had taken months to pull together. Once that power was finally assembled, it carried enough weight that the men watching from the ridge walls didn't dare pull their triggers. That was the first surprise for the family, but the second was how quickly their network of loyalty and obligation fell apart once it became clear the momentum wasn't going to stop. The eldest son was already sitting in a cell, and a second son was caught at a relative's place 2 counties to the east where he'd tried to hide after the first deputies moved through. A third son, the one whose name kept coming up in the stories neighbors were finally willing to tell, was found right there in the hollow at a neighbor's house instead of his own. That detail alone told a story about what he expected to happen next, and he didn't put up a fight, at least not the kind of fight the family's reputation suggested he might. 60 years of successful intimidation had never prepared any of them for a moment where fighting back simply wouldn't accomplish anything. One man was never officially found or accounted for by the law. He headed up into the high ridge country when the deputies first showed up, and he never came back down, or at least nobody ever confirmed that he did. Whether he died in the mountains during that first winter, crossed over into Tennessee under a new name, or just found another hollow to disappear into, is something no record ever settled. The trials stretched across several months of 1902 in the county court, and they produced a public accounting that the hollow had never seen in all its history. Witnesses who had stayed quiet for their entire adult lives sat in that courtroom and described exactly what they had seen and what they had been forced to endure. One woman who lived 2 miles up the creek from the family property talked about a night in the late 1880s when she and her husband were told to stay inside and keep quiet. She described the sounds she heard coming from the trail afterward, and her words carried the weight of years of silence. A former timber scout told the court about being stripped of his horse and gear at the trail entrance and having to walk 14 miles back to the nearest settlement. Two men who had traveled through together in the mid-90s described other travelers they'd seen at the house who never appeared on the trail behind them when they finally made it out the other side. None of these stories were enough to prove a crime on their own, especially since mountain courts back then didn't work with the kind of scientific precision we expect today. But the cumulative weight of the testimony, combined with the physical evidence pulled from the creek bank, built a record that the defense couldn't tear down. They found disturbed ground and recovered equipment, along with items at the house that the family couldn't explain away, and the lawyers couldn't move fast enough to keep up with the evidence. The two sons who went to trial were convicted and given long sentences. The time they were ordered to serve was long enough to ensure that neither man would ever return to the hollow in any way that mattered. The reaction from the community wasn't what you might expect to see in a movie. There was no cheering and no big crowd gathered outside the courthouse to celebrate a victory. What people described in the old church records and local papers was something much closer to pure exhaustion, and they used the careful language of people who had lived inside a shadow for so long they were only now allowed to name it. It was like a heavy weight they'd carried for decades, a weight they had stopped noticing because it was just part of life, was finally being set down on the ground. The hollow itself didn't celebrate either. It just went quiet in a way that felt different than before. It wasn't the pressurized silence of something watching you from the trees, but the flat and directionless quiet of a place that had lost the one thing that used to organize it. The family was broken, but the hollow remained. The timber company eventually got exactly what it came for. Within 3 years of the trials, survey crews were finally working the ridge walls that had been off-limits for 60 years, and the hollow was selectively logged by about 1908. They stripped the slopes they could reach and left the steeper ground alone because the cost of moving equipment up there still didn't make sense, even with the new rail connection only a day's ride away. The old creek trail was widened enough for a wagon to pass through in most places, and a few families who had spent a generation hiding in the corners of the hollow started farming plots of land they'd never dared to touch before. In one way, the whole thing looked like progress because the hollow was open and people could move through it without paying a soul. The trail became ordinary, just another path through the woods, but the opening of the valley wasn't a clean or easy transition. Some of the families who lived deepest in the hollow and had stayed the quietest decided to leave rather than stay once the old structure collapsed. They scattered into the neighboring counties or moved into the mill towns growing along the new railroads where nobody knew their names or where they had come from. A few of them never spoke a word about the hollow to their children or anyone else, and they dealt with the memory the way people deal with things they can't explain. They buried the past and just kept moving forward. What survived in the local memory wasn't always accurate. Stories that had been told for 30 years before the trials already felt like legends by the time the lawyers got involved. And those legends didn't stop changing just because the courtroom was empty. Depending on who was telling the story, the family became either monsters born of the mountains or desperate men who made hard choices because the country gave them no other way to survive. Neither of those versions was the whole truth, but both made the storyteller feel more comfortable than the reality of the situation. The truth was that a single family had built a working system of control across 3 generations and kept it going through selective violence and the careful management of fear. They kept operating that system long after the people around them had lost any real way to say no, and that is much harder to walk away from than a simple story about a monster. The hollow wasn't unique in any of this, though that's the part the local stories almost never mention because those stories are about people, not patterns. Western North Carolina had other hollows with the exact same arrangements, and you could find them in eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, and the high ridges of Tennessee too. The names changed, but the structure stayed the same. When you combine isolation with a single point of control and a history of unpunished violence, You get a condition that appears wherever the geography allows it. It wasn't an accident of history. It was a result of the state's refusal to spend resources on places that didn't produce anything the government wanted. The law only arrived in those isolated places when the cost of staying away finally became higher than the cost of going in. The names of the people who never made it out of the hollow, the travelers whose families never saw them again, and the neighbors who paid in silence, never made it into the official trial records in any real way. Some were mentioned in passing during the testimony, but most of them just disappeared. The hollow kept those names the same way it kept everything else, holding them in the ground and under the water beneath the thick second-growth timber that grew back once the loggers moved on. Which brings us to the one question that nobody back in 1902 ever thought to ask. When you look back at the trial records from 1902, you'll notice they never actually touch on the structural reality of the land, mostly because courts aren't built to handle big questions about how a society functions. They only care about specific men and the specific crimes they are accused of committing. The real question we have to ask is why it took 60 years for the law to finally show up. It isn't a question of why these things happen, because we've already walked through that history, but rather why the state chose to leave that hollow alone for 3 full generations. You could give the easy answer and say it was the distance, the rough terrain, or the sheer cost of sending deputies up a trail that barely existed. While all of those things are true, they don't give you the complete picture, especially since Western North Carolina had plenty of other dangerous corners where the law managed to find a way in when it really wanted to. Distance never seemed to stop anyone when a mining company needed a strike broken by force, or when a federal marshal had to serve papers on someone who had become politically inconvenient. In these mountains, distance has always been selective. The truth is that the hollow simply had nothing the state wanted badly enough to go and get. There was no taxable production coming out of those woods, no strategic roads or bridges, and certainly no voters with enough political pull to make the county seat pay attention. The families living inside were poor and unconnected, and they produced absolutely nothing that would show up in a ledger the government cared about. Because of that, the hollow existed in a state of administrative blindness, where it wasn't exactly invisible on a map, but it was invisible in every practical sense, because looking at it cost money, while ignoring it cost nothing at all. Everything changed the moment the timber company arrived with its surveyors and its capital, and that specific kind of institutional patience that involves filing letters until they get what they want. At that point, the hollow stopped being invisible, because it was suddenly standing between a corporation and its inventory, and that corporation brought its own lawyers. This isn't just a cynical way of looking at the past, it's just the way things were. The law in these isolated mountain stretches has never been a constant presence like it is in the flatlands or the cities. It functions more like an occasional visitor that only knocks on the door when the cost of staying away finally becomes higher than the cost of going in. In this particular hollow, it took 60 years for that gap to close, but in other places that were further from the rail lines or lacked valuable timber, that gap never closed at all. Those places didn't end with a trial or a headline. They just quietly faded away as roads and time eventually killed off the conditions that made them possible in the first place. Western North Carolina didn't just transform into a different world the morning after the 1902 trial ended. Even though the hollow was opened up and the family was broken apart, the physical geography of the ridges stayed exactly the same. What actually shifted was the economic map that the outside world layered on top of the dirt. Between the rail access and the logging crews and the federal agencies that were starting to grow their budgets, the remaining pockets of independence were squeezed out not by a fight, but by being connected to everything else. You can't run a private toll on a trail once it becomes a public road, and you certainly can't govern a hollow once it's been subdivided and logged and tied into the county tax rolls. If you go there today, you'll find the creek still runs through that same ground. The ridge walls are still there, and they are still steep enough that the sun disappears early in the afternoon, casting a long shadow over the valley well before the evening arrives. The rhododendron eventually grew back over the scars the loggers left behind. If you were to walk through that hollow now, without knowing the history of what happened there, It would feel the way all old Appalachian ground feels, which is to say, it feels ancient and indifferent. It holds on to its secrets without any interest in sharing them with you. That silence is still there, but it doesn't mean the same thing it used to. The mountains didn't change, but the people who had the power to use them did. For 3 generations, a family built a world that the state ignored for 60 years. And that didn't happen because nobody knew they were there. It happened because nobody in power decided it was worth the price of admission to find out. The travelers who went in and never came